All right. And we are being recorded. All right. Welcome everyone to our adult ed class this evening. We are beginning our dive into the book of Job, where we will be spending the next 4, 5, 6-ish weeks. I'm planning for this to be a 5-week class. If we get through the material quickly, it could be 4. If it ends up not going as quickly, it could be 6 weeks. So we'll just have to see how it goes. I wonder how many people have the study guide that was sent out on Monday. I hope that everyone has a chance to have one of those.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
Yes.
And I also hope that everyone has a Bible close by, because not as much this week, but especially the next 4 or so weeks, we are going to be doing a lot of Bible reading. So there is a lot of text in the book of Job, and we're going to unpack a bunch. But before we begin, before we get into any of that stuff, I just want to see where everyone's baseline is. So open question to everyone. What do we know right now about the book of Job? This can maybe be, we've read Job before and these are things we know about it, or we've heard Job read, preached before, these are some things we've heard about it. Or maybe, what are some questions about things we maybe know or have heard about Job that we would like to have answered, or questions we'd like to address at some point in our study? So just everyone feel free to just, whatever level you're at, if you have anything with Job, where are we at?
I have read it before and participated in one study of it several years back, so I am somewhat familiar with it. I guess one question I would like to throw out there is, there's a lot of people, a lot of collateral damage, if you will, that occurs in terms of the bad things that happen to Job also means bad things happen to a lot of other people surrounding him. And it was just always one of the things I take out of that is, there was, how do we justify that in God's mind, that there's a sort of play going on, and yet with respect to Job, and yet there's these other people, whether they be friends or relatives or whatever, who are suffer and die and that sort of thing. That what about them, so to speak? So that's my take, or a question, something I'd like to throw out there.
The story of Job goes through undeserved suffering and speaks with God, and God responds to Job that to live in an amazing and complex world that's not designed to prevent suffering. Rather, we need to trust God's wisdom when we encounter suffering. I need to go on to say, many of you know that I was born and raised as a Hindu. I came to this country as a student and converted to Christianity after reading the Bible and receiving a call. So when I first read the book of Job, I was very amazed, because this story is identical to the story of the Harishchandra in the Hindu Bible, which was written about the 500 BC. So I was amazed. It's identical story. A righteous king, God-fearing, goes through a lot of suffering, loses his kingdom, loses his wife and children, becomes a slave in a cemetery. And then God appears to him saying that I'm so pleased with you, I'm going to restore everything, which is what happened to Job.
it almost seems like this story, and I've heard that of other religions as well, a very similar story in many other religions. And yeah, I was looking at I've got a study Bible, on the computer and stuff, and it gives you a synopsis in the beginning and a little bit of background and stuff. They're saying that we really don't know who Job was. He lived maybe somewhere between 1 and 2000 BC, but the book was written, maybe 1,000 years BC or sooner. I think that, if I recall reading that correctly, but these stories go back. Pastor, how far back does this story go? Maybe not just in the Bible, but as humanity knows the story from across the world.
Yeah, one of the things that we're going to get into later in our session today is some other stories from the ancient world that are very similar to Job, and how the existence of some of these stories make things like authorship and date of Job very difficult to figure out, and also how some of the things that are main talking points in Job and in these other stories that are 4,000 years old or more are things that still very much are talked about in religion and theology today. So yes, we are going to get there today. Anybody else have anything we may know about Job, or any questions we may want to ask about Job? And if not, that is also okay, because it is totally okay if there are people coming into this going, I've never read Job. I kind of know a little bit of the story, but I've never actually read the text, and I am a completely clean slate. That is also totally okay. Don't want anyone to think that that's not acceptable. If that's where people are, that's where we're going to be. So, anybody else have anything?
Well, I got to go on to add one more item about the Job that I experienced. In the 70s, I was a member of the Griffith Lutheran Church, which was a Missouri Synod. And Book of Job became a controversy in the seminary in Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, because there was the charge that the seminary is teaching that the Book of Job might be a parable instead of a true story, which didn't go along with the hierarchy of the Missouri Synod. So they fired the professors, the students walked away, became seminary in exile, which eventually joined the Lutheran Seminary in Chicago. And there were some 230 churches that broke out from Missouri Synod because of this Book of Job. Those churches eventually became the ELCA combination in the 90s. Anyway, so that's the other part about Job that I know.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things with Job, as with a lot of other texts in the Old Testament, whether it be Abraham, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, there is very much the sense of, is this a true story? Was there really a guy named Adam in a garden who met a girl named Eve? Did it happen that way, or is it just the story being told that way? And I could definitely see how in the Missouri Synod, if someone were to say that, well, maybe it didn't fully happen that way, how that could cause some controversy. We're not going to fully go into that in our study of Job. The short answer to that question is there's not really an answer. Asking if there really was a guy named Job is kind of the same as asking if there really was a guy named Adam, or looking at any story from any other religion in the world and asking, well, was this a real person or is it just a story? And for our purposes, that's not really a super important question. So we're not going to really delve into that much, but yeah, that it is definitely controversial in that way. Any others? I know I've asked like 2 or 3 times, but I can't see everyone's face, so I don't know if everyone's sitting there like, yeah, or there's people going, yeah. So, but since I'm not hearing anything, okay, you can't be on the keyboard. You can't be on the keyboard. You will mess with the Zoom. All right. Well, we're gonna get going, and if anyone else has anything they want to add, just feel free to stop and say things at any point. So before we can talk about Job, we really need to talk about the genre that is wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is the most common form of literature in the ancient Near East. Pretty much anything in the ancient Near East that's 1000 or 1500 BC or earlier, there's a good chance that if we have it, it's wisdom literature. In wisdom literature, the word wisdom is a little more complex than what we may think. Wisdom both means the way that we think, but also what we learn thinking that way. So the best example I can give is that modern day theology and philosophy are a lot like wisdom literature. On the one hand, if you're studying theology or philosophy, you have to think, you have to approach it a lot differently than if you're studying like math or chemistry. It's a different way of thinking. So one aspect of wisdom comes from being able to think differently, to have that approach. On the other hand, wisdom can also mean the knowledge you gain through the process of thinking in that particular way. So wisdom literature is both the way that we think and the knowledge you gain through thinking in that way. Does that make sense to everybody? Fantastic. So wisdom literature is pretty much always written in the form of dialogue between individuals. This could be 2 people talking to each other, a person talking to a friend, a person talking to a sage or a mentor type spiritual guide, a person talking to a god, whatever you have it. And typically these dialogues are, there is one person who is talking about a particular experience, and the other person is interpreting their experiences in a way that they hope to offer teachings about divinity, teachings about virtue, teachings about things like suffering and goodness and righteousness. Job is not the only text in our Bible that we could classify as wisdom literature. A lot of the writings in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes have a lot of similar properties in the sense that it is somebody talking, it is the writer talking to the reader about ways to interpret everyday experiences and how you can see the divine working through those everyday experiences. And one of the ways that Job is very invested in this idea of looking at the tradition of wisdom is that Job delves into this idea that is called divine wisdom. On the bottom of the first page of the handout, there's a little bit of a block quote. This article that I put down in the bottom by Paul Fides, I don't know how to pronounce his name. If I ever ask him, if I ever see him, I will make sure I ask him how to pronounce his name. In this article, I took about 4 or 5 different points that the author was making and kind of smushed them all together and filled in the gaps to try and make everything he was saying fit in a couple sentences. So I'm just going to read basically what this is about. In Job, divine wisdom is something that is inaccessible, since God is the only one who has true wisdom by being able to grasp and understand all the complexities of creation. God offers glimpses of wisdom, but only to those that God chooses to do so among those who are faithful to God. God's speech to Job is about how God maintains order in creation, and therefore how God has true wisdom, since order is at the heart of wisdom. So we can see that Job is following in this idea of this tradition of wisdom literature, not only in the sense that most of the book is dialogue between two characters talking about these ideas of suffering and godliness, but also in the sense that it kind of is written in a way that God is this ultimate form of wisdom that all the other characters may try their best to understand the nature of God and the nature of wisdom, but ultimately, because they are not God, they are unable to fully grasp wisdom and the world the way that God sees all things. So does that make sense with everybody? Excuse me. So on this little chart that I included on the second page of the handout, I talk a little about how there's wisdom literature in the Bible and how that wisdom literature parallels other ancient texts. While there's no way to prove that the person who wrote the book of Job knew about these other ancient texts from like Sumeria and Babylon and Egypt, there are a lot of similarities in the book of Job that point to the idea that, well, the author of Job may not have, been directly copying ideas from these texts or taking ideas from these texts. There's enough to suggest that the author was at least aware of some of these texts. So let me give the first example in this little chart that I've got on the page. The Sumerian creation story debate between winter and summer. The story goes like this. There are two brothers born to a god named Enlil, named Summer and Winter. Summer gives people the ability to work in the fields, tend to livestock, and cultivate the harvest, while Winter irrigates fields and brings water to the river so the plants can grow. The two brothers go to their father, bickering over which one of them is greater, offering up the work that they do. Summer saying, look what the humans do because of me. Winter saying, look what the earth does because I bring it water. And the father decides that one of them is greater than the other, saying that the gift of water is greater than the gift of harvest and tending to livestock. And the other brother isn't very happy about this. This is kind of similar to the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis, where these two brothers are bringing offerings to God the Father. God chooses one of them as more pleasing of an offering than the other, and the other brother's not very happy about it. So can we see that kind of connection there, how there's these similarities between these stories of wisdom literature from other cultures when we look at some of our biblical stories? Okay. So when we look at the book of Job, there are quite a few similarities. So the Sumerian story, dialogue between a man and his God. If anyone knows anything about the story of Job, this might sound familiar. So a dialogue between a man and his God. A man has endured much suffering and prays to his God, asking what he did to warrant his suffering and wonders what he did to deserve it. The God appears and tells him that he has always watched over the man and will provide for him eternal life if he remains faithful. That's very similar to a lot of the things that happen in Job. My favorite similarity is, have we all heard the verse Job 38:3, where God says, gird up your loins like a man and I will question you, that kind of, brace yourself because here it comes. In this Sumerian story, dialogue between a man and his God, when the God first appears and talks to the man, the first thing the God says, directly translated from Sumerian to English, is gird up thy loins. again, not really proof per se that the author of Job is taking ideas from these stories, but things like this happen frequently enough to give scholars the thought that the author of Job had to have at least been aware that these stories existed, because there are so many similarities between some of the stuff that happens in Job and a lot of other ancient texts that it just seems like it can't be coincidental.
Is it true, though, that a lot of the ancient texts also have a history of the flood?
Yes. Yeah, there are stories of flood being used as creation in many global religions. Even a lot of Native American tribes even have stories of floods. There's some even Native American tribes that they tell the story of a great flood covering the earth being I want to say the third creation. So giving this idea that this story of global flood, not only is it not exclusive to Christianity, to Judaism, but also that there are creation stories from other cultures that even predate this idea of global flooding, which seems to be a very ancient text in many of these Near Eastern ancient religions. Another one of these ancient texts I want to look at is a poem from Babylon called Babylonian Theodicy. First of all, before we continue, does everyone know what the word theodicy means, or is that a word for most people that haven't heard it before, wondering what it is? Because it is going to be very important for us the next probably 4 or so weeks.
I'd be interested in knowing what it meant.
Okay. All right, so we got one interested in knowing. All right, maybe more. So theodicy basically means theology related to studying and questioning the relationship between God and suffering. So if you're studying theology, if you're writing theology, and you're trying to answer the question of why do people that are faithful to God suffer, or suffering exists in the world, does God allow or cause suffering? Any questions relating to the nature of suffering, nature of God, and how those things all work together, those are questions of theodicy. Theodicy is a very far-reaching thing in the world of pretty much any theology, because pretty much anything that's ever been written about suffering people that is religious is technically a question of theodicy. So we're going to spend a lot of time these next few weeks when we're in Job talking about things that are questions of theodicy. So in this poem, Babylonian Theology, and again, to those who know roughly the story of Job, this might sound familiar. A suffering man is talking with a friend, and this friend is attempting to add perspective to events in the first person's life by telling them about the nature of justice and how his grievances relate to the divine structure of the universe. In Job, a lot of Job is just Job and his friends talking about what is the nature of goodness, what is the nature of faith, what is the nature of God, and talking about how those things all play off of one another. Just a fun little one I threw in here, because while this isn't technically considered wisdom literature, it is a very, very ancient text. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. In the 125th spell, I don't know why they're called spells, they're kind of like chapters. Anyway, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it is read how one of the most important aspects of Egyptian religion had to do with the afterlife. And in this particular section of the Book of the Dead, it talks about how when people die, they arrive in the hall of Ma'at. And in this place, they recite all of the sins they have not committed in their life to the divine judges to prove that their souls are pure. When we get into Job these next few weeks, one of the things that we're going to see over and over and over, especially from Job, is Job constantly repeating that he has been good, he has been faithful, he has been righteous. What he is suffering, what he is enduring, is not something he deserves because he insists that he is pure. So while it's not directly a one-to-one correlation, I think that that's interesting and worth noting. Anyone have any questions at this point? I know I threw a bunch of information out in a very short amount of time, and I know that there's a cute bird that is kind of distracting. So, anyone have any questions?
I guess my thoughts, question would be, who is the book intended for? I mean, I know Job is a rich guy, loses everything and then becomes rich again. I think the average person doesn't understand wealth and they understand suffering, but so I'd be interested, and maybe you're going to address that at some point, Ricker.
Yes. Examples of who the book of Job is intended for is actually something we're coming up on very shortly. But yes, that is one important aspect of Job is, you know, if this character Job isn't relatable, the story that the author of Job is telling doesn't really work for most people. And so, yeah, that is a very important question to ask. Anybody else? Any questions or comments about everything I threw out with wisdom literature before we continue? All right, then. I can only imagine that the bird is on my head because she would like a better view. So everyone smile. All right. So let's not start getting into the book of Job, but let's start talking about the book of Job. So in terms of trying to answer questions related to when was this book written? Who wrote this book? Where was this book written? Job is one of the most difficult books in the Bible to answer any of those questions. On the one hand, scholars pretty commonly accept, they can relatively agree that Job, the text, was probably written sometime between the 7th and 5th century BC, probably. So sometime in that 700s, 600s time period BC. On the other hand, there are a lot of words and phrases in Job that have origins in Arabic rather than Hebrew, and a lot more words and phrases in Job that don't appear anywhere else in the Bible. And there's lots of different ways to look at this. Some scholars say that Job having all of these words with different origins that don't appear anywhere else in the Bible prove that it is a much more ancient story than any other text in the Bible. Some people think that maybe this means, well, it's not necessarily more ancient, it was just written in a different part of the world. And there's even scholars that say, well, it was written in a time period and a place that we can kind of get behind. It was written in the 700s, 600s, and maybe written in Israel. And these words is just the author's way of trying to make the story seem otherworldly, like it happened in a different place, a different setting. All three of these arguments are pretty convincing, and I'm not gonna be the one to say who's right. All I will say is that while scholars can pretty much agree that Job, the actual text, was written in the 600s or 700s BC, it's also pretty commonly accepted that the origin of the story, the actual character of Job, if Job was an actual character, or the time the story was created orally, can be traced back to possibly as early as 2000 BC. And if that were the case, the story of Job would predate pretty much everything else in the Bible, from the patriarchs to the writings of all the other biblical books, by hundreds of years. So trying to answer questions of authorship, time, date, location of Job are very difficult. Yes. I saw someone unmuted, so I didn't know if someone had something to say. Okay. The question that was asked just a little bit ago as to who is Job written for? You know, who is the book of Job intended for? How is the book of Job important? There are 2 times in the Bible where Job is referenced in another book. I'm just going to go by the order I have on my screen. So Rhonda, could you look up Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14? And the next one I have on my screen is Dave Gerlach. Could you look up James chapter 5, verse 11? And let me know when the 2 of you have those looked up.
Got it.
All right. And Dave?
James chapter 5, what, Zach?
Verse 11, but you have James chapter 5?
We have James chapter 5.
All right. Rhonda, will you go ahead and share Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14 for us?
Yes. Even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these 3 were in it, they would save only their own lives by their righteousness, says the Lord God.
All right, thank you. And Dave, James chapter 5, verse 11.
Indeed, we call blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of the perseverance of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, because the Lord is compassionate and merciful.
All right, thank you. So the question of who is Job written for? Well, if we look at, you know, what is the main point that the book of Job is trying to get across, and what do the other biblical authors say? Job is an example of great faith for pretty much anyone that is ever struggling with anything that challenges their endurance of faith or their perseverance. So Job and a lot of these other ancient texts that we talk about are kind of very much universal texts, in the sense that it doesn't matter your culture or your context. A lot of these texts speak truth to a wide variety of people in times and places, because they're focused on the question of what does it mean that good, faithful people have to deal with suffering? And that is the central theme of Job. The question, the main point that the author of the book of Job is trying to write about, is trying to answer: why do the righteous suffer? Now, this isn't the only theme in Job. The secondary theme of Job is also kind of similar, in the sense that there's this question of what does it mean to be righteous? Because there are quite a few instances in Job where Job is saying, well, I don't deserve this suffering, I've been righteous. And one of his friends will maybe respond with, well, maybe you haven't been as righteous as you think, and you're being punished for not being righteous enough. So while it is important that we talk about this question, why do the righteous suffer? Why does suffering exist? There's also kind of always this question in the background of, well, what does it really mean to be righteous? For Job, the answer to that is Job is righteous because of the way he lives out his faith. Job subscribes to a kind of faith that there's a phrase for it in Latin called do ut des. I'm not sure if I said that right. Pastor Eric will correct me if I did not tomorrow. But this phrase in Latin, what it translates to is I give so that you may give. This is very much the way Job lives out his faith. Job gives of himself to God so that God may in turn bless Job. Job is faithful not only because he follows God, but because he understands that in order for him to be blessed by God, he has to first give of himself to God. It's kind of transactional in a sense. Any questions, comments, concerns by anyone on where we stand so far with everything we've gone through tonight?
So if it is written 6th century, 7th century, that's exile, Babylonian exile. So if it is written, then I guess the one amazing part about Job is there's only God talking about creation. That's all, just creation, many aspects of creation. But God doesn't refer to, remember I brought you out of Egypt. Remember I gave you 10 commandments. Remember I brought you the promise. None of that is mentioned, only creation. That's it. That's the intriguing part about it. You know, if it's written in a obscure land of Uz, wherever that is, far away from Israel, and Job is the only God-fearing man, and God answers him only talking about creation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that is something that not only does that kind of lift up the almost alien-like nature of the book of Job, in the sense that, you know, we have God appearing and we never have God talking about, you know, remember these promises, remember this covenant, remember all this stuff that I did, despite the fact that it's commonly agreed that the time period we're looking at for Job being written as a text would be slightly before or during the exile. There's none of that stuff. The other thing that Nick, you just mentioned that I want to lift up, that we're going to get into this shortly once we start reading the actual text itself, is that God in the book of Job behaves very differently than God does in most of the rest of the Bible. If we look at like the book of Psalms, there are times in the book of Psalms where the psalmist is like, God, do you not remember this promise you made to your people? Do you not remember how you would save us, how you would deliver us? Do you not remember this? Let me remind you in case you forgot. And in the book of Job, we have God who basically appears on the scene and essentially puts Job in his place. And it almost kind of seems like he goes, how dare you question me? How dare you question the one who created all things? So the character of God in the book of Job is vastly different than in the rest of the Bible. It's almost kind of like God in the book of Job is a completely different person than the rest of the Bible. And that is definitely something that we are going to be talking about and looking at, not only later tonight, but in a few weeks when we get to the things that God says when God appears on the scene, how God is very much not the same character that God is in the other 65 books of the Bible.
I think Nick made a very interesting point, though. It seems that this book of Job happened before God's promise and covenant with the children of Israel. And the question becomes is, how is God's nature different than the nature of God before he had his covenant with Israel? And was it more remedial, more and less faceted than this? Because I think Nick did make a very good point there. It appears that this came before the covenant with God, and God would have been a would have had different variables and would have had fewer elements to draw upon.
Yep.
Yeah, and And that's like the story of Noah, where God destroyed the world with flood and made the covenant with the rainbow, similar.
Mm-hmm.
Probably predates that story too.
Yep. Yeah, if the original story of the book of Job is, like some people say, from 2000 BC, it would predate everything else in the Bible by quite a few centuries. But I think that even if we look at, some of the characteristics of God in some of these very early biblical stories compared to Job, there's even some, strange differences. If we look at God, the way God behaves in like the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, or with Cain and Abel, or the Tower of Babel, God sometimes appears on the earth, sometimes does things to mess with people. In the story of Cain and Abel, God punishes Cain for doing something wrong, but when Cain pleads to him that his punishment is too great, God listens to what he has to say. In the Garden of Eden, when the man and the woman are talking to God about why they did what they did, they tell God, I did it because my husband told me to. I did it because the serpent told me to. God listens to what they have to say. And even in that perspective, God's kind of strange in Job, because in the book of Job, Job is sitting there suffering these horrible things. And he's like, God, grant me an audience. Let me ask you what I've done to deserve this. And when God appears, God's basically like, hey, stop talking. Listen to what I have to say. I'm not even going to answer your question. So even in that perspective, in the book of Job, God kind of acts strangely.
Yeah, but didn't the Apostle Paul also ask God, why am I suffering like this? And he said, my grace is sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's a characteristic of God that would be the same between the two.
Yeah. Although there is a subtle difference there in the terms of when God appears in the New Testament and grace is sufficient, it's very easy to just instantly connect it to Jesus' forgiveness and life. In Job, God isn't really there to show up and tell Job, hey, you're okay because I'm gracious, I'm looking out for you. You're okay because I'm watching out for you. God basically shows up and says, I'm in charge, don't question me. Not really any of the other comforting stuff. So I'm not going to say that God is completely alien in Job, but there are some times in Job where God seems to do things that are a bit strange when we look at most of the rest of the Bible in comparison. So. All right. Well then, it's time to actually turn to the book of Job and start digging into it. So this first session, the only reading into the book of Job we're going to be doing is the Prologue Narrative, which is just chapter 1 and chapter 2. Before we get into it, we need to talk about that there's two main things that we need to understand about these first two chapters. The first thing we need to understand is that what happens in the first two chapters of Job is basically setting the stage for the rest of the book. Most of the book of Job, from chapter 3 to the first half of chapter 41, 42, 41. I can never remember if there's 41 or 42 chapters of Job. Either way, what happens from the start of chapter 3 to the beginning of the last chapter is Job, his friends, and God just talking. So the first two chapters have to set everything up. First two chapters have to explain who these characters are, why they're here, what's going on that's brought them together in this way under these circumstances. So if the book of Job is a play, the first two chapters are definitely like the opening narration or the very first scene of the play. The second thing that the first two chapters of Job, the second purpose that they serve, is they establish a tension between the divine perspective of suffering and the human perspective of suffering. Because as we're going to see shortly here in chapter 1 and 2, the divine perspective of suffering and the way that they understand it, the way that it is seen by God, is vastly different than the way Job and his friends talk about it and understand it throughout the course of the rest of the book. And basically, that's the first 2 chapters of Job, is setting up everything that's going to happen and drawing the reader into that tension between divine and human perspectives of suffering. So continuing to go in order on my screen, Tom, could you read to us Job chapter 1 verses 1 through, okay, I know it says on the page verses 1 through 6, but can you do verses 1 through 5 for us, please?
There once was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's house in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did.
All right, thank you, Tom. So I've just got 3 little questions jotted down on the note sheet. This is just to kind of spark some thoughts in the brain, some quick fire thoughts. We could do discussion on these, or these could just be short points of reflection. At this point in the text, does Job seem like a real person? It talks about how pious Job is, how devout he is in his religious observations. Does this seem like it's something that's real, or does it seem too good to be true? At this point in the story, is Job relatable to us, or is Job just this person up here that we don't really feel any connection to? Any thoughts?
I would say, based on his possessions, it doesn't really seem like that, because they have 3,000 camels. It seems unimaginable.
Yep. That agrees. Yeah, that is one thing I've always found interesting about Job, is that, you know, he has to have 3,000 camels, and he has to have 500 donkeys and 500 yoke of oxen, 7,000 sheep. It seems a bit over the top.
Right.
You might be running a very large conglomerate business we're in. Having 3,000 camels out there is kind of necessary for the business, because everything you look at here, except for the sheep, are transporting things. The oxen, camel. You know, he was just the prehistoric trucking company.
Yeah. There we go. Job is the transnational sheep farm, and the camels, yoke it. Donkeys and oxen are just transporting goods across.
He was evergreen.
Although I might add, I doubt if Amazon in it would have had that many, and if they were delivering by in that manner.
Job, 2nd millennia BC, Amazon confirmed. Yes. Job is Job is a Jeff Bezos, just very more pious. I like it.
I don't even know if Solomon had that many.
I do not personally know. I'm pretty sure there's one point where a ruler from another land comes to visit Solomon and they bring 50 camels of just fragrant spices as a gift, but I don't know. Those numbers seem a bit excessive. And for it to be one person, like this isn't Job and his family having all this. This is Job having all of these animals and having these 10 children and the army of servants running the whole thing. So yeah, it is rather impressive.
Just think how many people you would have to have in your employ to care for that many animals.
Mm-hmm. I think I like to think that the author of Job was like, okay, yeah, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, and then how many servants? Let's just put a large number and leave it at that.
With respect to how relatable he is at this point in the narrative, because he was a man of God, blameless, maybe everybody was envious of him. He said, boy, it'd be nice to be like Job.
I mean, that could very much be a possibility. The one thing that we have to keep in mind, though, is that we're looking at this as Christians here in 2021, Lutheran Christians. So we see that someone believes that they are purely righteous and that they are upright and blameless before God. And for us, we kind of go, ugh, that's not possible because we know about sin and grace and all those things. But this text, like we said, probably written 700, 600 BC, even if Job is far more ancient than that, these ancient religions, for them, blameless and upright doesn't mean the same thing it does for us. There are plenty of people in the ancient world, not just Jews, but in many other religions, that believe that being blameless and upright, following all the wills and decrees of whatever God figure you worship, is something that is humanly attainable. So that is a slight difference we need to keep in mind as we read that Job is blameless before God's sight. That for us, it does mean a little bit different than what it would have meant 2,500 or even 4,000 years ago.
Another question, Pastor.
Yeah.
It says in there that he would get up and offer the burnt offerings. At what point did burnt offerings to God become a normal way of worship?
Uh-huh.
When did that start?
That is an extremely good question, and that goes back to our earlier discussion about difficulties of dating the book of Job, because those traditions of burnt animals, burnt offerings as sacrifices, those were established with the tabernacle laws. In our Bible, that would have happened after the Israelites left Egypt and while they were wandering in the desert. But the stories of that weren't written down until centuries later. So if Job is written 700, 600 BC, then yeah, of course, Job did burnt offerings to God because he was a good and faithful Jew. And as we all know from the tabernacle laws, offering burnt offerings is a good thing to do. But now, if Job is a story that the origin of the story predates many of the other things in our Bible, including the Exodus from Egypt and even the patriarchs, then there's kind of that thing of, well, how would Job know that? Or was this just something added in by the author? So then this is where we once again get back to that question, is Job a real person, or is this just a story that's being told? And again, not really a question that can be answered, because like pretty much everything else in the Bible, no objective way to prove that this is 100% true and happened, but we have faith that the story is written and it is, whoever wrote it was divinely inspired by some experience they had with God in some way. So there has to be some sort of truth in it. But yeah, very good question, because that again kind of gets into the chronology of when the biblical texts were written versus when they maybe actually happened. Any other questions, or are we ready to move to our next section? By the way, I am very sorry if she is being distracted. All right. Tom, I had you read last, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So next on my screen would be Nick. Could you read for us Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12, please?
One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan who also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and from on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, and a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. When Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear the Lord for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you on your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
All right. Thank you, Nick. So what do we think of this passage? Does this portrayal of God consist with other parts of the Bible, or does anyone look at this idea of God acting like this and maybe go, I'm not super comfortable with the thought of God acting like that, and kind of just throwing a faithful person under the bus and saying, oh yeah, Satan, go ahead and mess with them all you want. Go for it. How do we feel about that?
Very disturbing that God would even treat Satan that way. Satan should be thrown under the bus to begin with, and God treats him as his equal in conversation.
Yeah, it is interesting that in this passage, Satan just kind of pops up in heaven, and God's just like, oh, hi, how are you doing? What are you doing here? And Satan's like, oh, I'm just walking around the earth, got bored. It is a very, it's a strange interaction, to say the least.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I've heard people liken this kind of scene to like the old movie in the 80s, Trading Places, where the two rich guys said, well, why don't we just swap the places between the rich guy and the street bum, and kind of a similar kind of deal, making a kind of a swap, and let's see how it turns out.
Yeah, the scene kind of does have a movie vibe,
Yeah.
It almost seems like this portion it was put in afterwards to create the story. It's almost like, how could, if you want to tell the story about this super, super rich guy, it almost now at this point, it makes it more of a parable than it does in actuality, to me anyway, because it's like, here's a guy who had a run of bad luck. Let's say we thought that, or we knew that Job was real, and he had this really super run of bad luck. Everybody gets wiped out in one day. Well, how could you explain it? And then this would explain it. It's almost like it was brought in afterwards to go, well, this is the only plausible explanation to all that bad luck that I just had.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up, because one of the things we need to keep in mind with these first two chapters is the point of these first two chapters is to set the stage for the rest of the book. So it doesn't really matter if Job is a real person that all of this happened to, or a story that this author is making up, because the main point of the book of Job is we have a man who is righteous and is suffering for an inexplicable reason. In order to get to that point, the person who's writing the book of Job needs to come up with some way for God to allow this suffering to happen. So if you're the writer of the book of Job, regardless of whether or not you're making up this whole story or if it actually happened, and you need Job to be suffering and you need God to allow it to happen, what's a way that you would write to make it possible? The idea of God being so confident in Job's faithfulness that he gives the devil permission to wreak havoc with Job's life just to prove the point that Job is so faithful that he would never turn against God is kind of a compelling idea. It may make God seem to be acting very weird. It may be kind of troubling, but within the narrative of Job, literally speaking, it's a compelling idea, and it serves the purpose of getting all the characters into the place they need to be for the actual meat of the book to start in chapter 3. So yes, while this is troubling to read and it is kind of concerning that God would act like this, it is very much the author taking literary freedoms in how they begin the story of getting all the characters in the proper place.
Okay, so I always think about who wrote it and why did he write it, etc. How did the author know that this conversation happened in heaven?
Yeah, exactly. And to that effect, again, does it really matter if Job was a real person or not? No, because either way, the author made the choice to write the introduction this way, to have God and Satan have this interaction so that the rest of the story makes sense. So, yes, while God definitely acts very strangely in the introduction, it is a little bit of a source of comfort that the person who was writing this wasn't there for that interaction. So we can almost confidently say that this didn't happen exactly how it was written, and God probably doesn't really do this to God's faithful people, because that's a source of comfort to me.
Yeah, but isn't it also possibly a source of comfort knowing that if bad things happen to you, it isn't because you have sinned against God too? I mean, there is no such thing as Santa Claus, and bad people get better gifts than the good people. That's just the way life is. That doesn't mean that you've sinned.
Yeah, and the idea that suffering doesn't come from sin is, it's not only something that we can see here early on in chapter 1, but it is something that Job will insist upon for the entire rest of the book, is that suffering does not mean you have sinned or done anything wrong. Sometimes you just suffer because you suffer.
Well, as far as the Bible goes, this really sets a very early precedent for the suffering of Christ as well. I almost could read that and go, you set the stage for something like this where really, really bad things happen to really, really good people, because it's not important what happens to us here. Any bad things that happen to us here, what's important is if you're still serving God. So the earthly things really don't matter.
Yeah, and
anyway,
yeah.
so.
And while that may not be fully echoed within the book of Job itself, what did those two texts that we looked up earlier, Ezekiel 14:14 and James 5:11, what did those two lift up when they mentioned Job? Exactly what you just said, is that if you're suffering, that's not really the important part. The important part is that you remain steadfast in your faith and you endure the sufferings. Yeah, it's a great tying together of some of the things we talked about earlier, and also leading forward into what we will be doing with Job for the next few weeks. Anyone else? Or are we ready to tackle another section?
Just one more thing in the Oxford annotated version of the Bible that I have. It says, in the book of Job, Satan is not yet the personal name of the devil, as in later Jewish and Christian literature. Rather, the Hebrew, which simply means the adversary or the accuser, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, we talked a lot about how God acts kind of strange in this book, but if we think about it, Satan also kind of acts a little bit strange compared to most of the rest of the Bible. When we think of the character of Satan, where does Satan appear? He appears in the Garden of Eden and is like, hey, you should do this thing that's wrong, but it's okay. Satan appears to Christ. Hey, you should do these things that are wrong. And then here in Job, Satan appears directly to God and is basically going, hey, let me mess with this guy just to prove to you that he's not as good as you think. So as much as we talk about how God is kind of off or acts a little bit weird in this book, Satan also, the portrayal of him acts a lot differently. And again, what you said about how Satan meaning the accuser, not meaning the Jewish tradition of Satan, that could also be due to the fact that, maybe this original story is from 2000 BC and comes from the time before the patriarchs and before the Jewish religion was fully established. We don't fully know. But yeah, it's another one of those layers as to why the book of Job is so interesting and different compared to many of the rest of the texts in the Bible. But yeah, that's a good point. All right, then. I am being aware of time, so let's just do one more passage and we can finish off chapter 1 this evening. So next on my screen would be Mark. Could you read for us Job chapter 1, verses 13 to 22?
One day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell on them and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose, tore his robes, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all this Job did, not sin or charge God with wrongdoing.
All right, thank you. All right, so the beginning of Job's suffering. What do we think about this scene of Job just hanging out and a servant runs up and, oh, all the oxen have been stolen and the servant's killed and I'm the only one that escaped. All the donkeys have been killed and everyone else died and I'm the only one who escaped. Your children all died and I'm the only one who escaped. This kind of soap opera-ish TV drama style scene of just these messengers running up with more and more bad news. And Job's reaction is to fall on the ground in worship and saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. What do we think of this scene and this reaction?
Very absurd. There is no, he doesn't walk around to investigate. Right away, he tears his robe and shaves his head. It's absurd.
Yeah, I think absurd's a good word for it. You know, this almost cartoonish style of servants coming up one after another with more and more bad news, him losing everything that he spent a lifetime building up, whether it be thousands of sheep or 10 children, and he just falls on the ground and praises God, saying, God gives and God takes away. It's a rather absurd scene. Yeah, it's a very good word for it. Anyone
Well,
else?
two of them occur at the eldest brother's house, right? Same day. Yeah, the eldest brother.
Yeah, all of these things occur at the same day because, yeah, one day Job's sons and daughters were feasting, drinking wine. A messenger came, and then the last messenger, while the third one was still speaking, says, your sons and daughters were feasting and died. So, yeah, all these things happen literally right after another. Bang, 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 bang.
Wonder why it doesn't mention about his wife.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very interesting point, that God gives Satan permission to do whatever he wants with everything Job has. And he has all of the sheep and oxen and donkey and servants and children killed. And then in the next chapter, Job's wife just shows up and is fine. It's a very interesting decision.
But doesn't the wife also poke and prod Job a little bit and ask him, why aren't you cursing God after all these bad things? Just almost a necessary tool for Job's continued temptation.
Yeah, yep, that's the end of chapter 2. But yeah, even more bad stuff happens to Job, and his wife just shows up going, just curse God, die, and end your suffering. I mean, it's simple. Why aren't you doing it? So yeah. And it looks like we're gonna have to get to that next week because it is already after 8:30. That doesn't mean we're done though. Like if anyone still has anything that they want to say on those last few questions, we can still sit here and talk for a bit more, but I just realized the time. So we're not gonna go any further into the study guide or the plan for this week. Anyone else, any last minute questions, thoughts, reflections on anything we've done today?
Yeah, I'm very impressed by your relating to people, explaining. I commend you a lot. You make a great teacher.
Thank you. I've been told by a couple professors at seminary that I should get a PhD and be a professor. And as flattering as that is to hear, I don't think I could teach. My wife teaches, and I come home every day and see all the work she has to do, and I'm like, I couldn't do that. So, but I do very much appreciate that. Anyone else? Anything before we sign off this evening?
It's a good start to an interesting book. Stay tuned.
It definitely will be interesting. We are going to spend a good portion of the next 4 weeks talking about suffering, God, why do people suffer, what does grace, justice mean, what does faithfulness mean. That word theodicy I talked about in the beginning, we're pretty much going to be talking about theodicy for the next 4 weeks or so. Yeah. Well, I am thankful for everyone that joined tonight, and I look forward to all of you returning next week. And I guess I'll just say, take care, everyone. Stay safe this holiday season. If you're going shopping or anything, avoid all the crazies. Any traveling coming up soon, safe travels and happy holidays early.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Right.
All right. Good night.